Good morning. I think, as you all know, Secretary Miller is working hard at the Paris Air Show. I think it's early afternoon there now, so the business usually moves to the restaurants and the cocktail time. So I don't think he'll be watching our meeting. As we have done in the past, we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and we'll move into our agenda.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
A couple of announcements before we start. First, we have new technology today. We have multiple screens in the center, plus new microphone and speakers in front of us. If you have any questions, our very capable AV staff is behind the screen, and at break you can certainly check in. But one of the things that I think will benefit us is we have great speakers in these desktop units. Second is with a note of sadness that I identify that today is the last meeting for two of our colleagues. My good friend Carlos will be leaving after 2 full terms as a CTB board member, and Mr. Dodson will be leaving us as well. The secretary has asked me to hold off on any presentation of accolades, speeches, and well wishes until his return. So he will be back tomorrow.
Vice Chair, it's going to be hard in my case to
make
do
this
that. Okay, I know that.
With that, we'll start with Joanne Maxwell, who's got a presentation on the pedestrian bridge over Route 311 on the Appalachian Trail. Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I am here to brief you actually on 2 documents for which ultimately the Commissioner and/or VDOT will be seeking board approval and the authority to sign. One is a memorandum of agreement with the National Park Service as well as supporting entities. The other is a special use permit with NPS. Both of these documents relate to the Route 311 pedestrian bridge that carries the Appalachian Trail over Route 311, and that particular project is a project that's already in the 6-year improvement program. We are here just to talk about the agreements or the documents today. Just a brief background on the Appalachian Trail and this particular bridge. The bridge would allow the trail users to cross over Route 311 at a grade separation, as opposed to today where they have to actually cross this area of the road on foot at, avoiding traffic and having to keep an eye out for traffic. This particular section of the Appalachian Trail is particularly well traveled and used by hikers as it takes them to the key destination point on the trail known as the McAfee Knob Trailhead and Scenic Overview. It's very popular. As I said again, currently those on the trail are required to cross Route 311 on foot at grade, and it's somewhat of a safety issue. Basically, the bridge will go across Route 311 and connect the parking area that is currently there to the trailhead. The project itself will consist of the new bridge, retaining walls, and bridge approaches. The total project cost of the bridge is estimated to be $3.2 million, and HSIP funding is being used for the project. Again, the project is in this 6-year improvement program. This is just a depiction of the trail, the current parking area. You can see Route 311, and the bridge itself is in the aqua color, and that will cross over and provide access from the parking over to the trailhead. Currently today, on another note, there is also a shuttle bus that through DRPT and the County of Roanoke, arrangements have been made for a shuttle bus that carries potential hikers from the park and ride at exit 140 off of Route or Interstate I-81 to the actual trailhead itself. That bus will continue to operate during the project. That's important because the public or the parking area at the trailhead will be closed while VDOT is constructing the bridge. Just a little bit about the project schedule, where it is. We've already, VDOT's completed the willingness process, in essence, the public comment process. There are no utility relocations that are subject to this project. The project is anticipated to go to advertisement in August. Project award is anticipated for November 2023. Once the project is awarded, the parking area will be closed to traffic. We anticipate that the bridge would be completed in October of 2024, at which time the bridge would open to pedestrian traffic. So the two documents that we ultimately will be asking for or seeking board approval for, as well as the authority to execute, involve the MOA with National Park Service, as well as two supporting entities. The memorandum of agreement basically establishes the roles and responsibilities for VDOT and each of the parties to the agreement, the National Park Service, as well as the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and the Roanoke Appalachian Trail Club. As noted in the past, the board is provided authority by code to enter into agreements with the United States government. Since National Park Service is part of the U.S. government, we will need board approval. Core provisions of the MOA include mainly that VDOT will construct the bridge and convey all rights and responsibilities of ownership to the NPS once the bridge is completed. Then NPS will assume responsibility for ownership, maintenance, et cetera, of the structure, and they're to do so in a way that does not adversely affect the operation and integrity of Route 311. The other two entities that are party to this agreement, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy will assist NPS in maintaining the bridge. In particular, they will be responsible for ensuring that the bridge is inspected every 4 years in accord with or in keeping with similar standards used by VDOT for bridge inspections. Then the Roanoke Appalachian Trail Club will be performing some of the more typical types of operational functions that they perform currently for trails. They will basically be looking at cleaning up vegetation, removing litter, and removing minor graffiti. So that, in summary, provides, the details of the MOA. The next document that we'll need approval of is the special use permit. That is a permit that NPS requires in order to provide VDOT access to the parkland while we're constructing the bridge. They have already executed the permit itself, and we're just waiting for approval and authority to execute. Again, same authority stands as before. The board has the authority to approve or enter into agreements with federal entity. So in summary, in July, we will be back seeking CTB approval of the proposed MOA, CTB approval of the special use permit, and then a delegation of authority for the commissioner to sign.
Questions? Mr.
Mr.
Merrill?
Chairman, thank you, Joanne. Just a question, there's a related issue arising in Clark and Loudoun County with regard to the Appalachian Trail going over Route 7. And can you advise the funding, you said HSIP, as well as who initiated this activity? Because there's a group right now that's trying to get a bridge put over Route 7 right there at Bear Chase.
Mr. Chair, a little history about this particular project. This was initiated back in 2016. Actually, it was VDOT staff that made application for the HSIP funding. It was backed by local governments. It was also backed by then, I believe it was Senator Kane. But again, the need that was identified was the fact that, we had pedestrians crossing the road. So back in 2016, 2017, application was made through the process and awarded. And again, currently the project is funded. So I don't know if that addresses the question.
So I heard you say that VDOT initiated this request.
Back in 2016, 2017, yes,
So
sir.
if the Loudoun County, Clark County, Potomac Appalachian Trail Club want to pursue doing a similar thing, which they've already started talking about over Route 7, VDOT could assist with this.
Mr. Chair, I may have to defer on the commissioner on that, to the commissioner on that.
Mr. Chair, I'd say that
we have taken the Highway Safety Improvement Program and have changed the metrics with which we allocate funds for safety purposes. I think if this bridge came in, since it was approved in 2016, the board took that action to be able to fund it at that point in time. I think the board has the purview to be able to do what the board desires, but the safety program in itself has changed to a systemic improvement process with known countermeasures, as well as reopening it now to spot improvements that have demonstrated safety needs. If a bridge has a safety need, then I would say that it could fall into the spot. But I don't think, looking into a crystal ball at this point in time, I don't think that a bridge would meet the metrics today of the safety program to be funded out of that funding pool.
Thank you. Mr. Yates.
Secretary, I'd like to echo Mr. Merrill's comments on that. I've hiked that section many times. That is an extremely dangerous crossing. Traffic's going through 65, 70 miles an hour. There are people with children trying to cross 4 lanes. It's really, really dangerous, and that's an AT section that's very, very popular. So I would do anything I could to support a pedestrian bridge there.
Mr. Miller, I would add to your comments. I've been contacted by the Appalachian Trail.
It's a terrible spot.
Yep.
Terrible spot.
Very-
Really dangerous
very
for
dangerous.
pedestrians. Yeah.
By the Appalachian Trail Group as well recently, and they've got 4 crossings that they'd like us to consider making improvements in the pedestrian facility. So I think that's something we can coordinate in the near future. I believe they're in the process of putting a letter together requesting specific action on those 4 crossings.
I would think they would help with funding too, wouldn't they?
Well, I think they're looking for us to get the ball rolling on this. They may.
Funding, I would think, yeah.
They may.
I'm a member of that too, yeah. Yeah. it's
Any
really-
questions, comments? Ms. Maxwell, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Swanson. 495, South Side Express Lane Study.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I have before you a presentation to discuss the I-495 South Side Express Lane Study, identify what's been accomplished to date, and also discuss what efforts remain, with the understanding that we'll be coming back to this board for a location decision sometime later in the future. So to start discussing the study area, I'd like to orient you just to the Express Lanes network in Northern Virginia, which is more than 90 miles of express lanes that are either planned or currently in service. Right now, there are 84 miles in service of this network, with another 13 currently under construction. So there are 2 studies that are being performed. I-495 South Side Express Lanes is one of those. It is the blue dotted turquoise line that you see on the map here, just below the city of Alexandria, that runs from the 95 Springfield interchange and east into Maryland. So here's just a closer look of the South Side corridor that we are studying. It's 11 miles of the southern section of the Beltway, which is from 495, extends from the Springfield interchange to the west in Fairfax County and extends into Maryland at the 210 interchange in Prince George's, Maryland. It is important to note this is the last section of the 495 Beltway in Virginia where express lanes have not been implemented. So while we are showing the terminus starting at Springfield to the west and then extending across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge and into Maryland again to the Route 10, that was really decided early in the study so that we understood if there were any planning considerations that needed to be noted along the bridge and as well into Maryland. But the actual extents for the potential improvements will be determined as part of this study later in time. So as we've done with our NEPA presentations over the last year or so is really to present this board where we are in the study, again with the understanding that we'll be coming back to this board to make an informed location decision at some point in time. So right now, just calling your attention to the blue headers at the top, we are between study initiation and preliminary alternative concepts. These blue headers are the milestones that this study will be going through to complete its study, with board briefings being planned as we move along through this effort. So in terms of study initiation, we have gone through scoping with the agencies, done some preliminary traffic analysis, developed our purpose and need, which I'll be discussing in greater detail later in the presentation, and have been doing extensive data collection and field work to understand where our potential impacts are. And as part of that extensive effort, we've also been doing public outreach with our cooperating agencies and the general public. So we've presented both to the agencies and the public an opportunity to inform the development of the purpose and need. We have worked through scoping with our agencies, and we've been doing several public information meetings that started in May of last year. We have been presenting throughout our last 12 months, presenting at our monthly NEPA agency meetings, which started in February of 2022 and presented through October of 2022. Through those efforts, we have obtained concurrence on the purpose and need from our coordinating agencies, and we've continued to update them as we've done more field work and gathered more analysis. We have an anticipated concurrence date for our range of alternatives, which we are set for later this fall. So just to give you a little context on some of the traffic analysis that we've done and why we are studying this in the first place. This map is a map of the corridor, again, from west to east, starting at the Springfield interchange and going through Maryland 210 and a little beyond. What this map or figure is showing is what the current traffic counts are for 2022, and then a projection of what traffic counts would be in 2050 if there was nothing done, which is referred to as the build alternative, no build alternative. As you can see in the regular numbers, for example, right there at the Springfield interchange, the 2022 traffic counts are 207,000, and in 2050, we expect those to be 252,000. Throughout the corridor, the increase in traffic counts range between 16 to about 22% increase. And why this is important is this corridor is already experiencing several areas of congestion. So what we have on the map here is a heat map, as it's referred to. Again, we are showing the corridor, but this time the west to east is working from the bottom of the slide to the top. You can see Springfield at the bottom and then Maryland 414 at the very top. So working from left to right, what we're really depicting here is the normal hours of a workday and that traffic we're likely to experience as part of commuter and other traffic. So on the westbound, which is the left side of this, you can see during the peak hours in the morning, there is significant congestion that's experienced from the Maryland traffic coming into Virginia right there at the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. And then you can start to see some of that same congestion show up again in the evening hours. On the eastbound lanes, which is on the right of the presentation, very similarly to what we experience with traffic coming into Virginia in the morning, we are seeing traffic congestion as that traffic moves back into Maryland there again right at the bridge. So just a little overview of the typical sections, the existing conditions of the corridor. Typically, there are about 2 typical sections. I should note that those do vary throughout the corridor, but in general, from Springfield to about middle way through the corridor between Eisenhower and Telegraph, there's about 5 lanes that are a mixture of general purpose lanes and auxiliary lanes, again, depending on where you are in the corridor. But at that point between Eisenhower and Telegraph, there are local and through lanes that are introduced. So if you look at that typical section in the lower right of the slide, those 2 lanes in both directions on the inside of the median are through lanes, and those are there to help carry that local or that through traffic through this area of the system without interruption with the local traffic, which are the 3 lanes on the outer sides of the section. Another discussion point that I had started to set up at the beginning of the presentation is the Woodrow Wilson Bridge itself. Early in the study, again, it was decided that the project would not widen the existing bridge. And then with close coordination with Maryland and other entities, we identified it was not feasible to relocate the concrete barrier between the inner and outer spans. It is the same barrier that is separating the local and the through traffic, and this is due to the fact that this is a movable bridge, and that concrete barrier is purposefully placed with the notion that the movable bridge has to have those barriers in those areas. And then you can also see there is space on the inside median in both the westbound and eastbound traffic, where the study would be examining if managed lanes were feasible as part of the range of alternatives, but it is important for this board to know it will not preclude space for future transit, including rail, should that decision be made in the future.
Second.
Mr.
So
Chair.
to be clear, we could add both additional lanes and still have room for transit on the bridge as it stands?
That is what we are evaluating right now. That will be determined as part of the range of alternatives, which will be informed as we move through the public information meetings and working with the agencies, including Maryland. So I noted before, we do have concurrence from the agencies on the purpose and need, and just to quickly summarize it, it's to evaluate the transportation improvements that would extend and improve continuity of the express lanes from the Springfield interchange, from the west through Maryland 210 interchange in Prince George County, Maryland. So the needs that we're looking to address are provide express lane system continuity. I mentioned it is the last portion of the Beltway that has not implemented express lanes. Provide travelers additional travel choice, reduce congestion, and improve travel reliability, which I think that heat congestion map helped identify, improve safety, and provide consistency with local and regional plans.
Mr. Kasprowitz? Question.
Ms. Hines?
So I note that the extent of the evaluation stretches into Maryland. I'm also really aware that there are issues with managed lanes in Maryland. Will the study look at different termini short of that full length of the corridor that's expressed here?
Yes, again, Mr. Chair, Ms. Hines, that is part of the range of alternatives to be studied. This sets sort of that largest extent possible. It may vary just depending where the impacts and the other input that we receive help determine that.
And I know with the north side piece that we're doing now, going up to the American Legion Bridge, there was an automatic, there was an assumption that Transurban would be the provider. Is there a similar assumption here on the south side?
Mr. Chairman, if I might answer that, Ms. Hines, the logical extension of the express lanes is not logical in this case. So it is the department's position that this portion, should we reach a feasible managed lane concept in this section from Springfield to wherever, that it would be a competitively bid project.
Great.
At that point.
Thank you.
But to follow on your first question with regard to where that termini is, we're going to start the study large, and we can always pull it back in once we identify what the Maryland's consensus is, Virginia's, and what forms a feasible study or a project to be able to advance to a P3 concept. So there's still a lot of work. We wanted to start larger, and we can always truncate it down depending on what the traffic shows, what the traffic and revenue studies indicate. But we have some work over the next 2 years to get to that stage.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that since the purpose and need talks about that Maryland termini,
Yes.
that if we decide something else is a better solution, we won't have kind of violated our purpose and need statement. That's my main concern, and you've allayed that, but that's what caused me to ask the question.
Correct. Very good.
Thank you. And then the last slide I have is just those next steps. I've kind of been discussing them as I went along. We are going to be moving into our next round of public involvement meetings in the fall later this year, really to help identify that range of alternatives and help inform that. And then we will be coming back to this board, providing various briefings on the range of alternatives, the recommended preferred alternative once it's identified, giving the public a chance for a public hearing, and then ultimately coming back asking for an action on the location decision on the preferred alternative. We are identifying fall of 2024 as that projected date, with the Federal Highway making a NEPA's decision later that year. So with that, I will open it to questions.
Questions? Hearing none, thank you, Mr. Swanson. Good presentation. Mr. Dudley, going to explain what our CTB board members have been doing with the revenue sharing. Give us an update. Thank you.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I think all of you are aware that the Secretary appointed a subcommittee to review a number of policy changes that the department recommended for both the revenue sharing program and the transportation alternatives programs. This presentation will go over those recommendations as well as how we got to those recommendations. So this first slide just provides a little background to put the rest of the presentation in context. We have a board policy for transportation alternatives that dates back to 2013, about 10 years old. In 2018, the board approved a new set of policy changes that also required the department to evaluate the effects of those changes within 5 years and then take actions as a result of that evaluation. Staff made those recommendations as a result of the evaluation, and as I mentioned, the Secretary established a subcommittee to review those recommendations. Oh, and by the way, just to give you a little context of the program funding, just to put it in perspective, revenue sharing, $200 million biennial state funding, funds come in years 3 and 4, transportation alternatives, about $55 million biannually. It's federal funding, funds come in the years 1 and 2, just give you a little background there. On this slide, we step back to the 2018 board policy changes for revenue sharing. Those policies reduced the maximum annual allocation request from $10 million to $5 million for revenue sharing. The changes also established a maximum allocation per project to $10 million in state allocations. It limited opportunities to transfer surplus funds from one project to another at the locality level, and it also eliminated the transfer of allocations on canceled projects. During our review of these changes, we found that these policies had immediate positive outcomes. We were able to get more allocations to more localities during the application process, and we were able to add more projects to the program rather than continuing to add projects to allocations to existing projects. Some of the specific observations were that during the last application cycle before the new policies went into effect, we were only able to fund priority 1 projects. Those are projects that already had revenue sharing money allocations on them. So we brought no new project into the program. During the following cycle, we were able to fund 47 existing priority 1 projects, but we were also able to fund 188 priority 2 projects, which means we brought 188 new projects into the program, as well as increasing deallocations across the state. Transfers of surplus funds to other projects from completed projects went down in the number, but the value increased significantly. Deallocations from completed projects went up by 4 times. Deallocations from canceled projects went up 4 times. And the number of transfers from ongoing projects was cut in half. All of this increased the amount of funding available to get new projects into the program. But while we found those policy changes did exactly what we wanted them to do, we still had opportunities to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of our program. We noted that many of these policies that we were considering for revenue sharing were just as applicable to the Transportation Alternatives Program. So we brought the recommendations to the Secretary, and he established a subcommittee, as I noted, to evaluate our recommendations. That committee included Mr. Yates as the chair, Mrs. Hines, Mr. Stan, and Mr. Laird. We've had 4 meetings during which time we've had a very productive involvement from other members of the board, as well as district staff and stakeholder localities during our outreach. We also surveyed our localities to gain their perspectives on some of the policy recommendations. Before I get to the specific improvement opportunities and recommendations, and because I just mentioned the survey, I wanted to share the results of our survey. The relevance to the survey to the recommendations will become apparent here in a few minutes. But first, we sent the survey out to all our locality transportation directors and public works directors, as well as our list of Smart Portal locality applicants. So every locality that has applied for revenue sharing or TAP over the past 5 years got the survey notification. We received 42 responses to our survey, and there are these are some of the specific responses, and I'll share some of the policy recommendations, like I mentioned in a couple of slides. A majority of the respondents were supportive of our recommendations, including keeping the applications on a biennial cycle, redistributing surplus project allocations statewide based on a statewide prioritization process, fully funding transportation alternative funding request, and making the allocation transfer process for revenue sharing and transportation alternatives consistent with our current 6-year improvement program policy. I'll go over those here in just a second. So these are some of our opportunities for improvement that we wanted to address with our policy recommendations. First, we noted that we had surplus allocations from completed and inactive projects sitting idle or being moved from project to project over the years, but never getting expended. Second, we saw a significant number of projects getting a very slow or delayed start, which of course only makes it harder to expend their allocations within their completed in a timely manner. Third, we wanted to make sure all localities had the same access to surplus project allocations in order to cover their project needs. And finally, we saw opportunities to improve the quality of the applications that we do receive, particularly with respect to transportation alternatives projects. The next 2 slides are small on here, but you have handouts for this. So you have another my 17 handouts, and what I'd like to do at this point is go over the policy recommendations and let you look at the handouts, so you don't have to squint to the board. And I'll start with the revenue sharing policy recommendations. And what you'll notice is that the first column here identifies the improvement opportunities that we're trying to address. The middle column is the specific proposed policy, and the third column is the anticipated outcomes that we expect. So the first policy here for revenue sharing is just to align the policy with the existing practice of a biennial cycle. Currently, the policy itself notes that it's an annual cycle. We've been practicing this for 5 years, so we want to move it over to a biennial cycle by policy. Second policy recommendation is to take all surplus funds from completed or canceled projects and return them to a statewide balance entry for redistribution based on a standardized prioritization or tiered process. We'll retain about $5 million in the statewide balance entry account for unanticipated needs and replenish as necessary during the application cycles and during deallocation processes. Our prioritization process would start with localities with a deficit at construction, award. So if a project gets to award and they're in deficit, we take whatever allocations we have and help them support getting that project on the street. Tier 2 would be projects that exhibit a deficit at advertisement. Tier 3 was projects that with a deficit during construction, and finally, Tier 4 would be projects with a deficit after construction completion. In effect, this would eliminate all individual transfer requests within localities. Any redistribution or increased allocation to a project would be based on our statewide basis or on a statewide prioritization process using this uniform reallocation process. We hope that this will make all surplus allocations available to all localities that need the funding, redistribute the available funds on an equitable process, and it'll align the premise that allocations are made to projects rather than to localities. So when folks apply for these funds, they're applying for project funds, not locality funds. Our third policy recommendation is to deallocate funds monthly. Currently, as you probably already recall, we deallocate the funds annually. To support priority or policy 2, we really need to do this on an ongoing basis. So deallocations will come to the board annually with the transfer process that Ms. Pryor brings to you every month. And finally, we see that lots of projects are delayed getting started. Agreements don't always get signed very quickly. So we're going to require that project administration agreements be executed within 6 months of the agreement transmittal to the locality. Today, it's a year, or it may risk deallocation. So those are our revenue sharing proposals. We go to the next page and look at the transportation alternatives proposals. Very similar, but a few extras. So first, let's align the policy with our biennial application intake process. That's what we do today. Second, we'll take surplus funds from completed or canceled projects, return them to a statewide balance entry for redistribution based on the same prioritization process that we do for revenue sharing. We have one caveat here, a little bit different. If a project that is selected by the CTB gets canceled within the first year, the CTB member that selects that project may go to the next project down the line and reallocate those funds. We'll do the same thing with the at-large members. And so in effect, this would again eliminate all individual transfer requests within localities. Hopefully this gets the money out to localities who need the money in a timely manner, generally right at advertisement or right at award when they need it the most. Our third recommendation, policy recommendation, is to fully fund project application requests with some opportunity to request additional funding in accordance with the policy and policy number 2. This mostly happens today. Most of our applications are fully funding, but the policy is that 50% of the funding request has to be provided. We do see when projects are funded at half or part, they often get canceled or they have a very delayed start because they wait until the next application cycle so that they can get all their money, which is understandable. This way we would give them all their money. Yes, sir.
Ask questions
Mr. Brown?
about that
Yes, sir.
because that's something that I frequently did in order to distribute dollars across especially the rural and more and smaller jurisdictions. So, and maybe I cut you off too soon. So tell me how that would work then if you have to let me back up. Because some of these rural and smaller jurisdictions don't have the funding capacity to do even a roundabout that may cost $6 or $8 million. And that there may be other higher priority or other demanding projects in your district. If you can't partially fund and allow them to build account balances to get there, then what would be the alternative for that locality who also likely is disadvantaged in smart scale?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Brown, what this will do is fully fund the requests. So they can, what we're asking them to do is tell us what you need, tell us what do you need, and we will fully fund it. So the way I like to describe it, if it's good enough to fund, it's good enough to fully fund. Let's not give them half the funding and make them wait and maybe or maybe not get it in the future. That hurts us, it hurts them, it makes money sit. And I think you'll see with the Transportation Alternatives programs, it is a smaller program. We have a limitation on the allocations that we're going to provide to Transportation Alternatives projects. The average today is like $700,000. So I think this will help move things along. It doesn't mean they can't fund it in phases with their extra money as they move along. But if they're going to ask us for $1 million, I want them to have the confidence that they're going to get the $1 million and not sit and wait and maybe get the extra $1 million later on.
But I guess, but since your resources are limited, if you fully fund a project, that means you're not funding something else because your allocation is limited. So there has to be a consequence of fully funding, right? I mean, it's great if you're the project that wins, but if you're the project that would have gotten 50% but now gets nothing.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Brown, generally this happens today. Most of the projects are fully funded. Like in your area, you work very well with the MPOs to kind of match up the funding to get projects fully funded. So it generally happens today, but But all things, theoretically, yes, that there would be less projects funded in an application cycle, but ideally, you're funding the ones that are ready to go, they have good applications, they're ready to spend. So, but then the next cycle, that one would be funded. It would be ready to go. Hopefully, it'd be on the street. Then you get to the next cycle. Of course, all the funds are limited. It's a trade-off. But I think today, I can really tell you mostly things are fully funded today. In a few cases, they're not fully funded. But this just really gives the localities the confidence that they've got their money, they're ready to go. It also encourages them to give us better estimates. So if they know this is my one shot at getting funding, I better ask for what I need. I'm going to ask for what I need. I'm going to give it to you. And we can program money out through the years to manage our cash flow. But I think in the long term, this will get more projects on the street more quickly. You won't have hesitation. You'll get money spent more quickly. Remember, we only have 4 years to get these projects to construction for transportation alternatives. So partial funding these projects really does slow it down. And we see a lot of projects that don't get to 4 years because they don't have the funding yet. They won't start year one because they're not fully funded. They're afraid for this payback issue. If they spend money and then they don't have enough to finish it, they may have to pay us back. So they're not going to start till they get all their funding. So this should eliminate those issues. But you're right. We may have fewer projects funded, but I think as things work out, you're getting the same number of projects done over the years.
Ms. Hines?
Just, Russ, my memory is that we're going to see an uplift, too, in the amount of transportation alternatives money that the CTB members have available. Is that right?
We do. So IIJA gave us an uplift, $14 million or so. So we should see more money, and you'll see that here in another policy change here. And so the program is going to get larger. We'll fund more projects. So hopefully it's a good thing. It's all a good thing.
Just for my colleagues, I think I had $2 million in the last cycle. I think I had $16 million worth of requests from my localities, and many of them were over $1 million. I was just kind of rolling my eyes. So having more dollars available will be helpful. And for those of us who work with MPOs, there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate.
Here in this time, both these programs are overprescribed. We get way more, just like all our programs, we get way more applications than we could ever fund. I mean, there's so many needs out there. So we do
Mr. Merrill.
our best.
So is revenue sharing going away then? Is it jurisdiction going to get 100% of their funding for these projects?
So with revenue sharing, it's a little different because of the code language. The code language uses dollar values, so we don't use, well, we'll get to the numbers here in a second, but the code language requires us to fund up to a certain amount, and because it's priority one are revenue sharing projects that already have revenue sharing money on them. So that you get money first year, you can come back the next application cycle, you are by code definition priority to get the money next.
But you have to provide a 50% match.
But you have to provide a 50% match. It's
Changing.
that. Oh, yeah, absolutely not. It's not.
That's in
changing.
code.
That's a code. That's a code requirement.
And on top, it's a 20% match that the locality has to provide.
Good. All right, Mr. Chair. So I'll move on to the next one. So it's a good segue, as Mrs. Hines mentioned. We're getting more funding this year for transportation alternatives. Today, the policy just provides the district board members $1 million apiece. Rather than have a defined absolute number for each board member, we'd like to just make it a prorated amount for all the board members. So whatever we get, we prorated that proportionally to the whole board members. So of course, the at-large members will still select as a block. We do that so we can meet the population area requirements within TAP, but everyone will get the same amount. So the way it works out this year, if we use the same amount of money, it'd be 1.6 million or something to that effect if it stays the same. It just makes sense rather than just having an absolute number. Keep up with the changes in the appropriations. Our fifth policy recommendation for TAP is to establish a maximum lifetime award limit of $2.5 million per project. This makes the program more commensurate with the size of the allocations and appropriations that we get. I can tell you since 1994, I think when this program came into effect, we've had 12 projects go over that limit out of thousands of projects. So it's really not a huge effect, but we're sort of looking at, we have seen some requests recently where they're asking for, a lot of money. And that's hard for the board members to support, especially if we're going to go to let's fully fund the request. So we think 2.5 is an adequate amount. And, if over the years things start growing, we can relook at this. Our sixth policy recommendation to establish application caps for the program, and that would be, and our recommendation is 8 per locality for pre-applications and 5 for full applications. And the reason for this is oftentimes we see localities submitting many, in the teens, 15, 16 applications for TAP. And we know there are several reasons, I'm sure they have their own reasons, but we see a lot of poor quality applications coming in. They're not ready to go, but we have to spend the same amount of time reviewing those things as the great applications. We can't fund nearly all those projects, so what this will ask the localities to do is give us your best projects. Give us your best projects. Generally, we won't fund more than 8. Anyway, 8 seems to be a good number. We started off limiting the small localities too, but we had a recommendation that since you already have a hard time getting small localities to apply, give them the larger number too. Just make the number the same, 8 straight across the board. So we think this will work. Based on our experience, there's probably 6 or 7 localities that will have the biggest impact on this, and these are the ones that will apply for 14, 15 applications at a time. And we did have one locality tell us, yep, we're one of those during our outreach meeting, and that's because they allow one application per council person. So they all get to put in a project. So whether it's a good project or bad project, they all put one in. So I think that'll eliminate that. It'll cause them to pick their best projects so they can bicker amongst themselves before it gets to us. And then finally, similar to revenue sharing, we'd like to get these project administration agreements completed very quickly. So we're going to put the same requirement here, 6 months from the time they get the agreement to get it signed and get it back to us. It's really going to help TA because they do have a 4-year limit to get to construction. When they set on these project agreements for year plus, that cuts off a whole year from their 4-year requirement.
Mr. Merrill.
Mr. Dudley, that last recommendation was both in TAP and in revenue sharing that there are delays. Could you comment what's causing the delay?
I can't give you a specific reason. Sometimes it seems to me more administrative within the locality. It's certainly not with us. We for TAP and revenue sharing, we batch them all because we know we know what projects they are. They all come at one time, and we batch them all and get them out to localities. So I think some bureaucracies in the localities, just delays getting those things too. We'll work where we can with the localities to get things moving along, but I think
It's within their control. It's
yeah,
not,
we want to get these agreements signed and get these projects on the street. We don't want to delay this at all. So we had the policy as being a year from allocation, but we figured we should. Why don't we just cut it back to the time we give it to them rather than the time they get the allocation, since we start the application or the agreement process. They don't. So those are the policy recommendations for the two. First of all, I want to thank the subcommittee for the time. It was very interesting. We changed a lot of the policy recommendations we had at first based on feedback, not only from them, but from our localities, our district staff, and then the CTB members that were not part of officially the committee provided some feedback. So it was a good process.
Mr. Stant.
Russ, if the application doesn't come back in 6 months, it risks the allocation.
Yes, sir.
Who will make that decision?
I think generally we look at the circumstances and we want to be flexible with as much as we can. But occasionally, we don't get the good answer, the right
It
answer.
won't be the board, it'll be local assistants. that make-
It would be local assistance decision in collaboration with the chief of policy. And generally with the district administrator or district engineer, we'll go with the district engineer and say, what's going on, what's happening? We try to be as flexible as possible, but we really can't let these things sit out there for a year and a half or over a year.
I almost wish it were just automatic, because I tell you, people will push these things on and on and on, and risk and deallocation is different than automatically disqualifying.
Having a deadline. Yeah, yeah. Mr. Yates?
Mr. Secretary, as Chair of the committee, let me first of all thank the committee. We had a number of meetings, and also the CTB members who participated in the committee. Had a number of meetings and some quite long meetings and some travel time, so it was a much more involved thing than I thought it was going to be at the beginning. I also like to thank the staff, too. They've done an excellent job of summarizing and putting this together. I really feel that some of these things are really not changes. They're just existing policies that we're doing. And some of the changes will really effectively save a lot of money with staff changes, reducing the number of applications, things like that. So overall, I think it's a real good report. I do know that we have committee members and non-committee members who'd like to speak to a few other things on this too, and I'll turn that over to you and to them. But I just want to thank everybody again for a great exercise in committee work.
Thanks for your leadership, Mr. Yates.
No problem. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Other comments? Mr. Lawson?
Thank you. Mr. Dudley, you started with this report will go over the recommendations of the subcommittee, but I don't see the recommendations of the subcommittee in this report. And to Mr. Yates's comments, we did have 4 meetings. We had pretty robust stakeholder participation, localities in particular to participate in revenue sharing. And one of the things that I heard coming from the subcommittee, that in addition to these recommendations, that there would be a review of VDOT policies and procedures based on public comments to, in particular, make revenue sharing more efficient and cost effective. And I thought some really good ideas came out of that. These were very public meetings, and I think it's a shame that it's not in this public record, and certainly for the benefit of the other members of the CTB that didn't participate in the subcommittee. So I don't know procedurally how we get that in front of the rest of us, but I think it would be very helpful if we did that.
Sure. Nor do I, Mr. Lawson. Mr. Yates, was that actually one of the recorded elements of the recommendations from your group? This VDOT, I guess, review of VDOT practices?
I think it was a verbal thing, and as my notes reflected that we were going to get a resolution that was going to be circulated amongst those that attended, and then that would be written and presented to the larger board, which, to my experience, is how a subcommittee performs.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Lawson, so we're still working on the resolution. We need to get it. We've had some conversations with the secretary about what should be in the resolution and what won't be in the resolution. I will say that, and I think everyone who knows me here knows, if you have feedback or concerns about the programs, need more information about the program, I'm more than happy to talk to you about the programs, let you know where we're flexible, where we can't be flexible. I can tell you with the revenue sharing program, it is the most flexible program, local program we have with state funding. So I can certainly provide as much information or as little as you can, but we're still working on the resolution and working with the secretary.
So, Mr. Dudley, I'm sorry.
Mr.
Go ahead.
Chairman.
Well, I was saying, given the work of this subcommittee, it would be appropriate, I think, to circulate that resolution early in this process so there's a chance to review it by all who participated and make recommendations before we get to our next meeting, which is in July, of course, when we're voting to approve this. So if there's an opportunity to present this to the subcommittee group several weeks in advance, is that something we can expect? So that we make sure we incorporate any ideas that were shared as part of this, if appropriate.
I'll defer what I can and can't share to our legal counsel as far as, I think there's some FOIA issues. I know we had some FOIA issues previously about sharing some of the information, but
The draft resolution?
Sure.
Specifically?
I think so.
And Mr. Chair, to echo your point, we had public meetings, we made a recommendation, I assume it was recorded. I just think it would be best practices to deliver that to the greater board. Whether the secretary or anyone else follows it, that's up to the board, I would think.
Sure. I guess, I'm not being clear on how this process fully needs to develop, having access to the draft resolution before we get to the next board meeting for those who have participated would at least provide a chance to review and sort out those issues before we come to a final resolution.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Laird?
as context for what is being talked about, I think the reason that there was unanimous approval for this decision, or this brief that Mr. Dudley has put together, was the fact that this resolution was part of that whole voting process. It was the compromise that kept the group in check. And so I think it is important to provide what that resolution was.
Thank you, Mr. Laird.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Hines?
as the person who offered the compromise
Okay.
to keep the committee moving, let me say a couple of things. Mr. Lawson has referred to the fact that part of the concern that was raised was about how quickly these projects can proceed and whether or not the costs are inflated based on certain practices that VDOT may have. Does that fairly characterize it, Mr. Lawson? And as a compromise to continue to move this along, we suggested including an additional resolved clause that would ask that that issue be examined. It is not particular to these two programs. And I think we need to say that. This question plays out in these programs, but it's not particular. It plays out in smart scale, it plays out sometimes in locally administered projects that have VDOT oversight. So I was very clear when I offered the compromise that this is a pretty big question, and there's not a simple answer. It will require a lot of work. So that was kind of the context in which this was added. And I think it is a fair question for this board to ask. So whether it's in the resolution or whether it gets asked a different way, I think we need to have a way to understand this particular issue better. I also think we don't want to hold up these changes for TAP and for revenue sharing as they're in the cycle of funding applications next time. And the changes to these programs need to be well communicated to the applicants. So anyway, I just wanted to provide that context. And, whether it can be, whether that will be included in the resolution or not, as a member of the subcommittee, I certainly hope that it will, and I was the person who suggested that was the way we could resolve our difference. But if there's a different path that also lets it move forward, I think that's just fine too. But I thought the rest, that's kind of the context in which this all occurred, so.
Mr. Lawson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hines offered a great compromise, and she's doing it again. I would start, I think the easy piece is start with a process and let's confirm the record of what actually occurred, if for no other reason, for the benefit of the board members that didn't attend. Where it goes from there, I guess we shall see, and I would agree that the things we discussed in terms of being more efficient, more effective going forward is not just limited to revenue sharing. I would think that every entity should be self-evaluative and committed to doing things better. But I think we need to do that as board members to try to initiate that, and that came to light in these subcommittee meetings. And it was organic in the sense that it came from the stakeholders who did the survey and attended the meeting and spoke out about their participation in this process. But again, I think the easy part is let's just make a record of what we did. The board can then consider it, and where it goes from there, we shall see.
Mr. Dudley, is that something that, I'm assuming you kept notes on this?
Absolutely, we publish minutes. I'll make sure that's in the minutes. I don't recall what's in.
So we'll attempt to consolidate that, maybe circulate that information, and hopefully have the resolution in advance for review and approval, or review and comment, I'm sorry. Ms. Hines, thank you.
So again, here's the next steps. July, we'll bring the resolution, decision brief. Following approval, we'll have to put the changes to town hall for another public comment, and then September we'll issue final guidance documents. That's all I have.
Other questions for Mr. Dudley? Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your work.
Thanks to the committee. Just
Mr.
acknowledgement
Merrill.
for the committee's work, Mr. Yates, for your leadership on that committee. Thank you.
National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program update. Mr. Berg.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair. Morning, members of the board. So I'm here today to provide you with an informational update on the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, program. Just as a reminder, VDOT's Chief of Policy, Angel Deem, presented to this board in September on this program, and VDOT's development of our EV infrastructure deployment plan that was required under the program. So I'm here just to provide an informational update on the progress that's been made since then towards deploying our initial round of EV infrastructure funding under the program. So these first 3 slides here will just be background as a reminder of what was presented previously on the program. So the NEVI program was authorized by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the infrastructure law and federal highway program guidance provide pretty detailed program requirements. So really what we've done since the release of the plan is to implement those standards and requirements into our Virginia program. So the goal of the program is to strategically deploy EV charging infrastructure and establish an interconnected national charging network with the ultimate goal of 500,000 EV chargers nationwide by 2030. VDOT through the program will have around $100 million in federal formula funding over the next 5 years. VDOT is acting as the lead agency under the program, under the direction of the Secretary. And at this point, we have access to $36 million in FY22 and 23 funding under the program, which will really be used for our phase deployment. So for additional background, the program requires us to lay out our program goals in our deployment plan, which are shown here. So the first goal is to close the gaps in our existing charging station network by building out our remaining alternative fuel corridors, which I'll speak more to on an upcoming slide, and identify potential future corridors. Goal 2 is, as we build out this network, to maintain reliability and connectivity in these charging stations by establishing strict standards for the measuring and reporting and the operations and maintenance of these charging stations. And then the third goal is to, as we build out this network, to be sure that we are providing widespread access to charging stations across the Commonwealth in urban, suburban, rural, disadvantaged communities to provide all drivers access to EV charging. So in terms of the charging stations themselves, the program can fund the installation and upgrade of publicly accessible, what are called direct current fast chargers, DCFC. So that's the level 3, kind of the top of the line charging station that can charge a vehicle in 15 to 45 minutes. So the stations themselves under the program must be located along alternative fuel corridors. And on these corridors, they must be at most 1 mile from the corridor, at least every 50 miles, and the stations themselves have to have 4 charging ports capable of charging at least 150 kilowatts. The stations can also include on-site distributed energy resources, such as solar and battery storage, and the program will also fund up to 5 years of operations and maintenance funding. And third parties will be acquiring, installing, owning, operating, and maintaining the charging stations on third-party locations. So VDOT will not be owning and operating these charging stations. And the applicants under the program will be required to provide, at minimum, 20% in matching funding. So an overview of the timeline of what's happened under the program since its inception to today. So some highlights here. The program guidance was released last February. VDOT submitted our NEVI deployment plan in August, and it was approved in September. In October, we released a request for information to gather input from industry and other stakeholders. And then in November of last year, we began developing our request for applications process. And this process really couldn't begin in earnest until late February, when Federal Highways issued their final rulemaking, which really sets the detailed standards and requirements for what the charging stations themselves will look like. Go a bit more on what we've done since those final rules were released at the end of February. So those standards have now been incorporated into our request for applications process. We have engaged with the Office of the Attorney General for extensive review of our request for applications, and we have been working with consultant support to finalize those documents and develop a GIS interactive mapping tool that will be released along with the request. So I mentioned the alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs. So the takeaway here is that in this initial phase of the program, our build-out is required to be along these alternative fuel corridors. So these are nominated by states and designated by the Federal Highway, and they are basically make up the backbone of our kind of national charging network at this point. So on our AFCs within Virginia, currently we have designated essentially all of our interstates. So it's around 985 miles spanning I-64, 66, 77, 81, 85, 95, 295, and 495. So this network here shown in blue is really where this initial phase of funding will be deployed. And earlier this month, there was a release of the additional, the round 7, this next round of AFC nominations. So VDOT is currently assessing potential future nominations. We've conducted a public survey. We're doing some analysis of our existing network and where gaps may be to declare additional AFCs in the future.
Just a question about that.
Mr. Brown.
So, and again, I'm confident that you guys have thought through all this, but the interstates aren't necessarily where the problem is with regard to charging, right? It's really on the primaries that are not interstates, you know, your 58s, your 29s, your Route 1s, your places where, and so I guess, although it's logical to do the interstates for folks that are coming through, it seems like the market may be addressing that. Would it make sense for us to invest this capital to fill in those gaps? I mean, you know, 21 and 17 and those places.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Mr. Brown. Great point, and that is what we are doing. So the program itself, under the federal requirements, we have to essentially build out the interstates first. So that's what we're trying to do with this initial deployment that I'm speaking to today. We've identified, and I'll show another map here in a moment that identifies our gaps. So at this point, the market has addressed largely the interstates, but we have around 17 gaps that we have to fill before we are afforded that flexibility. So our goal is to really, you know, build out the interstate network so we can look more towards our state corridors of significance and other.
Mr. Stamp.
Did you say the fast chargers take anywhere between 15 and 45 minutes?
Chris, question following up on Carlos' comments. Do we have forward visibility into what the private sector is doing? I know Tesla's continuing to build their network at a very rapid rate, and they've just included GM and Ford as potential users of their network. I would think, to Carlos's point, the interstates are going to be corridors that very quickly have accommodations for electric vehicles. But to really get broad distribution of electric vehicles, we will need these secondaries. What information do we have specifically to identify how long those holes will exist and if they're being filled by private sector? I'd hate to see us duplicate facilities, which would then make them less efficient and perhaps less attractive from an investment perspective if there's private sector money that's going there already.
And can I add just one point to that? Not only would it be duplicative, but it's going to be much harder to attract capital
Of course.
on those rural primaries and secondaries where, again, there are population centers, but just, it's going to be very hard to make a business case to do that in those markets. And so that's part of where my concern is that if you spend capital where capital's already going to go, that's creating competition. Shouldn't the state be subsidizing where capital likely won't go? But, yeah.
Yes, so, Mr. Chair, Mr. Brown, we are coordinating with the private sector on this. They do tend to keep their future plans pretty close to the vest, as you would imagine. But I think, we do communicate our map and our gaps to them. And, when we declare additional corridors, we will put out that information as public. So, in our minds, that really informs their planning process. So if they are looking at a potential area, they are aware that there will be a future request for applications
Chris,
from us.
ask the
in that
question a
area.
different way. Do the federal dollars associated with this program require this interstate-centric approach to the location of these charging stations?
Yes,
It does? It
Yes.
specifically requires it?
yes. This is our step one, is to build out this existing network.
Mr. Stamp?
My only point would be, Mr. Brown, that secondaries, I mean, if you take an average car having a 200 or 300 mile radius for an electric vehicle, most of those people are going to be charging at home. And you won't, I mean, it's the interstates, I think, where the people are traveling long distances and going from state to state, where the
Yeah.
rubber's really going to hit the road.
Well, no, and I concur, and I think what I'm really suggesting is the capital is going to flow where the market is, right? So to your point, you're going to get capital that's going to flow to 95, 81, 64, because that's where the market is. And I don't know, and maybe what's not being said is that, well, we're showing this corridor and the private sector isn't showing their hand, but they may end up doing a lot of this for us. But what we know, and I can kind of use some of my experience from my day job, is the private sector isn't going to go where the market isn't, right? So I was down in Franklin this weekend visiting my father-in-law. There's not a charger off of 35, 58, probably 50 miles. I actually searched. I mean, fortunately, I didn't need to, but we're probably 70 miles from a charging station, anywhere in any direction. So the private sector is never going to go there because there isn't going to be that demand. And so it seems like what we ought to be doing is, if we want to facilitate the growth of EVs, stimulating the market where capital would not normally flow because you're not going to get a return on it, right? That's my only point. Yeah.
I think it's a good one. I think the other thing that I've been reading about quite a bit, Chris, is that the high-density apartment buildings and condominiums in some of our metropolitan areas are not well-served, and in some cases it would be an extended period of time before they are, which is limiting the use of electric cars where people don't have their own outlet to plug into at home, as Mr. Brown does. So are those considerations in this program allocation as well? I mean, places like some of our, mainstream locations in large cities are also underserved.
So at this point, the gaps that we have identified are mostly not in urban areas. As Mr. Brown said, the market has already gone there. So we're really at this point, not looking more at the community charging at the apartment building level. Once we build out this initial network, we will have more of that flexibility to look at some of our state highways that maybe still serve regional travel, but are not yet built out by the market at this point. So I think really our goal here is to meet the federal requirement under phase 1, and then we will assess how we can best meet the needs of Virginia's drivers in our second phase.
Mr. Chairman?
Science.
It strikes me that potentially this is a little bit like broadband, in that it went to certain places and there was just never enough density or demand to get it to be ubiquitous across the Commonwealth. And it does make me wonder, Mr. Berg, whether you all could do some forward thinking about some of these issues that have just come up, about how we might address it. Is it that there's a grant program, where we would bring the 20% match to make sure that we don't end up like we did with broadband, where we just, we have these terrible dead spots. So, and whether there are ways apartment buildings can be retrofitted that we could at least help people understand what the choice is and whether a locality chooses to go that direction or seek capital themselves. So I appreciate that the program's driving you toward a particular end, but I do think we could be creative and create some pathways to help localities and to solve for some of this potential dead areas.
Steve, good morning.
Morning. If I could just add to the discussion. So as Chris has already mentioned, the requirement to build out the interstate, and we believe we can achieve that, hitting that requirement with the first deployment of funding. There was a question about timeline. So we anticipate, Chris will get to a timeline slide for this first deployment, but we anticipate moving immediately to the second round of funding, which will be somewhere on the order of 20 million. And it is in that second round where we would start looking at these non-interstate facilities that we're evaluating currently as part of the next AFC nomination process. So that will put us closer to the community gaps that you're speaking of. There's also discretionary grant funding that's currently available, and Chris's team actively has been partnering with Virginia Clean Cities and other entities that are looking to do community charging with that discretionary grant funding. So we are certainly collaborating on a lot of levels beyond just this initial deployment of funding to support the interstate network. It's 5 years worth of funding, so we hope to move very quickly. This first deployment has taken a while because of the guidance, the lag in receiving the federal guidance, but we hope to quickly move into the subsequent rounds over the next 2-3 years.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smoot.
Thank you. Two questions. Generically speaking, who might the applicants for these funds be?
So in general, we expect it to be the existing fueling station operators, as well as retailers like Walmart. So, places you see EV charging stations today, such as Wawa's and Sheetz and Walmart's, already within the Commonwealth. We expect to see more of that. But also, honestly, this is a developing market, so we're leaving it open to any potential applicants. So EV charging stations are going into Starbucks on the West Coast. So we expect to see a pretty broad range of fueling stations, retail, dining facilities.
Okay. And will the 20% applicant commitment generally be what we will require?
Yes, at a minimum, we will require that 20%. That's required under the federal program.
I might just observe that I question the efficacy of anything that requires 80% government money to make it work. Second question, will people who wish to charge be able to reserve a time, or do they just show up and deal with whatever line, if any, is there?
So in general, those kind of management decisions are made by the individual charging station operators, and there's a number of different models. But one requirement under this program will be the network requirements. So all of these stations will be required to communicate with third-party apps and other services. So essentially, you can look at any charging station in the Commonwealth and see, is it in use right now? How many people are using it? What are the charging speeds that I can access? So some operators do provide the ability for their members to reserve a spot, some do not. So that'll be up to the individual applicants.
Does the app generally show in real time how many people may be lined up to use the facility? In other words,
The majority of them do not at this point, just
Okay.
because it's harder to track what an individual car is doing at a site. But they do show the number of open spots.
Okay, thank you.
So are there any limitations on who can apply for this? For instance, can Tesla apply for these funds as well?
So anyone who can meet the standards, so if someone such as Tesla, so the program requires the inclusion of a charging port that's called CCS, which is not what Tesla is currently using, but they do have plans to implement that in future stations. So as long as they did include the required number of CCS ports in addition to their own, then they would be eligible to apply. And we do expect to see some of those providers who will offer, dual charging ports.
And the amount of the grant, does it include or could it include the real estate acquisition cost, or is it simply, so what would the grant fund? Just the make-ready infrastructure, or could it also include the real estate?
It can potentially, but we have set, and I'll cover it on a slide here, we have set $1 million cap. So in order to really incentivize, existing stations, existing ready sites, we've set kind of a cap in order to direct the majority of that funding to the charging stations itself and the construction and operation of those. So it is an eligible cost, but we expect to see most of the cost going towards the charging stations. Okay, so a bit about our timeline. As Angel mentioned, so we project to issue our request for applications this July. That'll be followed by a pre-application conference and a question and answer period with the deadline for applications in September. VDOT will then take around 2 months to review applications with tentative award notifications by the end of the year. So a bit more on application eligibility. Again, these are all coming from the federal requirements under the program. So applicants must be a legal entity, including an individual, corporation, government entity, or tribal organization. Applicants must be either a site host or they must partner with a site host who can host the charging station equipment. They must be able to comply with the minimum federal standards as well as our VDOT program requirements. And again, here's that $1 million that I mentioned. They must be able to provide the non-federal funding match of 20%, as well as any cost above that $1 million maximum award. And applicants must be able to operate and maintain the station for the minimum of 5 years post-construction. So again, just more on those federal standards, just to show you the level of the detail that they require. So under these standards, dictate everything from the location, as I've mentioned, and the power requirements, to the transparency of the pricing, the availability and the uptime of the charging station itself. They must include contactless payment and transparency pricing, as I mentioned. There's standards around physical and cybersecurity and data privacy. These stations must be installed by qualified technicians, and there's significant reporting requirements that awardees must meet in order to report, in order to allow us to meet the federal reporting requirements under the program. And finally, some additional evaluation points that will be included in the evaluation process. So the pricing of the station itself, as well as the operations and maintenance, the qualifications and capabilities of the applicant, what site amenities they're proposing to provide, such as restrooms, dining, shopping opportunities, Justice 40 relating to the location of the station itself, small women-owned minority business participation in their application, as well as on-site renewable energy such as solar and battery storage. I mentioned earlier our interactive mapping tool. This is just a snapshot of that tool. So again, in blue, we have the alternative fuel corridors shown. And then in the blue dots, we have existing charging stations that meet the NEVI standards. And then I mentioned the gaps between those blue dots. That's where we're targeting our first round of applications. So the orange dots there give kind of a notional sense of where those applications will be received. But in the online version of this tool, applicants will be able to dial in to a specific gap, and it will identify the individual exits themselves for which we will be accepting applications.
Mr. Stamp?
One question. How many cars can be serviced in those existing charging stations in the 95 corridor right now?
So there's a range. Some just include 2 chargers, some include 10 or more, depending on the company that operates.
Say there's 25 in the 95 corridor, or 100, or 200, or 400, or
I would say it's under 100.
under 100. I mean, I'm just looking at the New Jersey Turnpike and the Sunoco stations on a summer day when there's 300 or 400 cars lined up to fuel that's going to take each car 10 minutes to do, and I'm looking at a 45-minute charging time. Something in the mathematics is not working for me.
So as Mr. Brown mentioned earlier, the majority of EV drivers right now do charge at home. So this is really just to supplement in terms of regional and national travel. But there will be increased demand along our interstates as well. So once we have this initial build out, there is the ability to come back in, and there is a requirement under the program to future-proof these sites. So essentially to provide additional space for future charging stations and to build out the conduit so it's much cheaper to go back in and double the capacity. So I think there will be growth in these existing corridors as well over time.
Ms. Sellers, and then Mr. Brown.
This is kind of hitting at Mr. Brown's question with acquisition costs, but when I look at some of these orange circles, these are some of our more rural areas, and I wonder if their zoning ordinances have even thought of solar and EV stations. And particularly in this corridor, you're going to need either a special use permit, a conditional use permit to operate a station like this. And are we taking that into consideration and looking at some of these localities and maybe not reducing, but giving some flexibility for these sites so that they're not held to the same standards as in Northern Virginia, where we see there are a lot of these stations which would suggest that they already have zoning in place? Are we going to work with these localities to make sure that their zoning is in place and help these applicants so that they can move through the process?
We have coordinated to date with a number of localities and MPOs throughout the Commonwealth, and we do share kind of common best practices for updates to zoning. So we do highlight that as something when localities approach us with interest in the program. We do highlight the importance of considering how these programs will impact zoning. And I think we also provide scoring for the capabilities of the applicants. So we ask them to demonstrate what experience they have going through the zoning process and permitting process, both within Virginia but also nationwide. So we are trying to look towards applicants who have experience doing this and who understand these local requirements and processes.
So just looking at the one orange dot there between Richmond and Fredericksburg, they have a very limited staff in that locality. And my concern is going to be similar to what we see in Smart Scale, where we just don't see them participating. And so have we notified, I believe that's Caroline County, to let them know that they are on a map like this, that they have been highlighted as a potential site and maybe need to seek some outside consult?
So a couple of points. One, again, that dot actually represents a range of, maybe 20 or 30 miles. So there's a number of localities that may be within that. But yes, we have worked communicating with our MPOs and locality partners and to socialize this map and let folks know where potential gaps may be, and we'll continue. When we release this final map, we will be communicating that as well.
So one thing about this, listen, a couple contextual issues about driving EVs. This probably does not include the Tesla charging stations, right? Because they wouldn't be NEVI qualifying. So the majority of chargers that are currently on our interstate networks currently would be Tesla, and they're not reflected here. Just the ones that I'm familiar with, for example, near Virginia Center Commons off of 95, and I guess it's the Route 1 exit just south of Ashland, you probably have 16 or 20 units there, just that one, in that one location. So your Tesla charging banks are going to be much more robust, and they're going to also be within this corridor, and they're not reflected there. So these are going to be supplemental to that. The other thing to know is that when you do drive an EV and you stop to charge, typically you're not charging to 100%. You're charging, they're typically going to try to stop you before you get below 20, and they're probably only going to let you charge up to maybe 60 or 80. And depending on your system, it'll say, well, to get to where you're going, you know, I've driven to Hilton Head, for example, and I've had one for 5 or 6 years, kind of a industry requirement, right, for what we do. But driving from here to the Hilton Head, it will tell you, stop here and stop here. You'll be at 20 or 30%, go to about 60%, go to the next place and stay for 10 to 20 minutes. But so you're rarely going to, well, say 10 to 20 minutes, stay for 10 minutes. So you're rarely going to sit there for 45 if you're paying attention, if you're on one of the major corridors. Now, if you get in that zone in the middle of the state there, you're you know, an 80, you know, you're going to be having to pay attention because you know, there's just nothing in between.
Next charging station, 100 miles.
120 miles. And actually that happened to me this weekend. And Frank, I just said, let me just check. And the closest one was 110 miles from like where I was in Southampton County. So that can be a little scary if you're driving an EV, and it makes you think. So part of what EV drivers learn to do is to think about their route before you go, because you don't want to get, I will tell you, 5 years ago when I first got my first EV, I drove it from Richmond to Portsmouth. Went on a full charge. I get to Portsmouth thinking there has to be a charger somewhere. They have what they call destination chargers. Literally, I have to go knock on the back door of a restaurant, and a guy had a charger that he had listed on the app with Tesla that I could use because I was on like 8 miles left. I think we're a little better now. But if you were an early adopter, those are the kind of things you'd have to do to be able to get back home. So so this is you know, good work, but there needs to be a lot of kind of practical thinking about where you go first. And I guess I'm a little concerned that we're subsidizing at such an aggressive level, basically Fortune 500 retailers, right? When they're going to probably do it anyway in some of these markets, but I'm sure they'll be happy to take our money. But it's a lot of things to think about here. For you guys to deal with.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see so many deserts here, to Mr. Brown's observation. And since we lost Mr. Johnson, I'm sure if he were here, he would be asking, what about the Eastern Shore? I mean, it's all on the interstate highway systems, but there's a whole lot of north-south traffic that comes down the Eastern Shore, traveling to the Outer Banks and places south. Is there any initiative to cover that area?
We're currently evaluating for this next round of alternative fuel corridors where we can best start to address these you know, visible gaps in our network. So we will continue to look at that this year, and essentially every year we have the opportunity to declare additional alternative fuel corridors. So we're definitely continuing to look at that. And just to jump back to the Tesla point from Mr. Brown, so if there is an existing Tesla station that's not showing on this map but is in one of our gaps, Tesla has the opportunity to apply for funding to essentially update that. So it would just be, you know, a small amount of money that they would request. So rather than building a new station, they could potentially apply, if they so choose, to upgrade their station to meet these requirements.
Two questions. When this was discussed in our environmental subcommittee, one of the discussions centered around the energy that the applicants are providing to power these stations. We talked about perhaps giving evaluation priority to those who had the lowest carbon, perhaps complete renewable portfolio of energy to power the station. That didn't make it to this list. Is that something that we have the option to include? Is the evaluation criteria something we generate for selecting candidates or applicants?
So we do have scoring relating to on-site renewable energy. So we are providing points for providers who include on-site renewable energy or battery storage. We're still kind of evaluating our ability to score applicants on where they generate off-site power.
Well, it's not where they generate, it's what they select actually from the provider. Is that correct, Mr. Brown?
Well, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Some could generate.
Of course.
But very few are.
Yeah, but I would think that the major benefit here, rather than on-site renewable, would be to provide evaluation benefit for those who have renewable portfolios empowering their stations. I'd strongly recommend that that be part of the evaluation criteria. And it significantly improves the performance on a carbon emission per mile of the vehicles that use those charging stations to go with a renewable portfolio. Second question is, who will administer these projects once we actually make awards to various applicants?
VDOT will, our
okay.
team.
So they'll ensure compliance with the original specifications and delivery, and thank you. Mr. Lawson.
If I understood your response to Ms. Seller about the orange dots, and it says notional, would we do better to have elongated orange areas so that you don't direct somebody, to use her example, to Caroline, when somebody in the next county over may say, oh, it's not for me. But you're trying to encourage somebody in those gaps. Same thing with the Harrisonburg dot. It doesn't have to be Harrisonburg, does it? Just somewhere along that corridor.
Correct. And in the next few weeks here, we'll be releasing an interactive version of this that will, it's just kind of hard to show those corridors on the map, so we just went with the dots. But the interactive tool will allow folks to zoom in and see the extent of that corridor and then see individual eligible exits with.
Because the blue dots, those are hard sites.
Correct.
The others, just, we're going fishing and hoping to get people in that area.
So prior to us requesting applications, we will release this for stakeholders to review.
I have one more follow-up to that.
Sellers, one more.
Have we coordinated with economic development too, to see, because there are some grants that go in that corridor that, particularly in these rural areas, are we coordinating with them to see if there are grant opportunities?
We have, at this point, we have not moved forward beyond just kind of our initial coordination of the program. That was not feedback that we received, was that there may be specific opportunities that we should look at. But I think so starting this month, we're updating our deployment plan. So we'll be conducting another round of stakeholder engagement, and that's a great point. That's someone we'll definitely continue to coordinate with. The last slide here, just in terms of next steps. So as I mentioned, we'll be looking to finalize our request for applications. And again, that'll include this interactive GIS mapping tool. And we'll have a final round of review with the Attorney General. And then we will release the applications, which will be posted to EVA. And we'll notify all of our stakeholders that this application has been made available. So that's all I have. Are there any additional questions?
Mr. Merrill.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I thought this was very rich dialogue. How do we reconcile some of the points that were made? I mean, I happen to agree with Mr. Brown that I think the market's going to fill in the high transportation areas. It's just like, Walmart, they know where to put their stores because that's where the people are. It's these rural areas that, to me, are going to present the challenge. So how are we going to reconcile our discussion today with what the plan is going to be in terms of how we prioritize funding?
So essentially, we have to fill out those interstates, and then that will provide us the flexibility to begin looking at areas that the market may not have addressed yet. So that is our goal.
First step.
And as Angel mentioned, we do have sufficient funding to build out these interstates in this first round. So our goal is to meet that federal requirement as soon as possible so we can then look throughout the Commonwealth. So
thank you.
That is our goal.
Other questions? Mr. Berg, thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation. Didn't
Yes.
mean to pick on you.
Let's discuss it. Ms. Farmer. Oh, I'm sorry. Shall we break for lunch at this point? Okay. I've just been informed that lunch break will start now and end 35 minutes, 40?
I'm giving till 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock's perfect, 45 minutes. We'll see you back at 1. Thank you.
Okay.
First up after our lunch break is Ms. Laura Farmer with the 6-year plan. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm here to provide an update on the 2024 through 2029 Commonwealth Transportation Fund 6-year financial plan, as well as the VDOT budgets for your consideration for adopting at the action meeting tomorrow. This presentation mirrors the same template and format as I used in April, and I'll highlight the differences between April and today. So just as an overview in terms of all the funding that's available for the modes of transportation in the Secretariat, the preliminary, that should say final fiscal year 24 through 29 6-year financial plan allocates $55.4 billion. It includes $988.6 million for Route 58 corridor bonds, as well as financing for the I-81 corridor. It includes almost $6 billion of transfers to the regional authorities and $913 million of dedicated revenue for the WMATA Capital Fund. The assumption continues related to the fuel tax revenue of $570 million over the 6-year period for I-81. Just over $16 billion is allocated to maintenance and operations. That includes both VDOT as well as the locality payments. And then just over $18 billion for construction, with a large share of $4 billion provided by others. This slide just as a reminder, there's no change from the previous assumptions. This is the tax forecast provided by the Department of Taxation to VDOT in December of '22, and it's used as the basis for our state revenue estimate. This slide is a view of the estimated revenues of the 6-year period, and any changes since April are highlighted in green. In the subsequent slide, I'm just going to walk through narratively what those values represent. And so under other fund revenue, if you recall over this last year, in the current fiscal year, we set aside a fuel reserve and then recommended deploying that reserve in the January, February timeframe for both VDOT as well as city street payments. We subsequently changed the city street payments to reflect those reserves, and this is the remaining balance of that reserve that was left over. We told you we would deploy those revenues in 2024, and so the $77.4 million is a highway maintenance and operating fund that's now made available for distribution. You'll see later in the slides the impact of that is really to crossover and make sure that less money is needed for HMOF efforts, and it's available for construction distribution. We also updated 66 Inside the Beltway's toll facility revenues since April. We've been watching that facility closely over the spring, and we've increased the revenue estimate for 2024 by $6 million. In terms of federal revenue, since the beginning of the year, we received notice of Virginia's share of the Appalachian Development Highway System allocation. So these federal grants are made annually based on the needs of the corridor. As in past practice, our eligible work on the corridor is on a corridor queue, and so we added that allocation to the project on corridor queue and have released corresponding Route 58 funding to be made available for the other segments along Route 58. And so the net change is 0, but it's an increase in funding for the federal award. In terms of the I-4 widening project, we received a rural grant award of $25 million to help complete the gap. We did not have that embedded in our federal revenue estimates for the draft, and so it's been reflected here.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Hines.
Ms. Farmer, so we have I-64 widening in the Smart Scale program at a dollar amount that I understood would take care of the rest of the project. Does this award of this federal grant change that at all?
No, ma'am. So in terms of the Smart Scale application, that was reflected when the application was put together. We just, for purposes of the financial plan, we had not classified it as federal revenue here, and so it's just making an administrative reflection of that grant.
Thank you.
In terms of other financing sources, we've updated the financing model for the I-81 corridor to accommodate some cost increases along the corridor for projects that have not advanced yet, as well as incorporating additional TIFIA financing over the life of the project, but not exceeding the authorized debt for the projects. This slide provides that estimated allocations by major category, and the changes are highlighted in green. In terms of debt service, we've been able to closely study the need of Garvey bonds. So over the last two program updates, you'll recall that we have not allocated additional Garvey bonds in the program, but there were bonds allocated to projects in the past, and those projects are now coming to fruition, but have not developed in such a way that we need to advance bond proceeds. And so we evaluated the debt service schedules, backed off on the need over the 6-year period, and that releases federal revenue that we use for debt service. And so the release of that federal revenue allows for additional federal funds for construction distribution. That is just shy of $30 million over the life of the 6 years. In terms of maintenance operations, we have very small updates to the exempt permit revenue estimate. Russ Dudley covered this when he talked about city street payments last month. This is just a reflection of that to both VDOT and the locals. It's a very small adjustment in those areas. And as I mentioned before, in I-66, we increased the revenue estimate on the facility in toll programs. In terms of construction, this just enumerates those steps that I described related to revenue estimates. The last one being the fuel reserves that were released in terms of state money, and the Garvey debt service release allows for additional funds to be available for formula distribution. It's around $100 million, and Kim Pryor will get into that in the 6-year program presentation later today. This slide just provides a view of the fiscal year 2024 budget. The revenues total for the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, $9.8 billion, which is an increase of 2.9% over the revised budget that you adopted in October of last year. And the pie graph just provides a distribution of those revenue sources. The slide provides the allocation of those funds programmatically, with everything included, the maintenance components of VDOT's budget and the CTF budget, represent 28%. Construction, with the addition of those grants and additional financing, we're at 37.9% in construction. And the funding for rail and public transportation and the whole components represent 9% of the budget. This slide just reminds you about the process that we go through to allocate funds and determine how much is available for construction. With those slight changes in revenue related to the fuel reserves as well as additional federal funding that adjusts what's available for construction, it also has an impact on crossover. And so as I mentioned last month, I'll hit some high points with the VDOT budget as well as discuss the impact of crossover. The budget totals $7.6 billion net of the regional programs for a grand total of $8.7 billion. As I mentioned before, we've allocated the federal fiscal year 23 earmarks that were announced in these last 6 to 8 months. And with the change, and I'll mention crossover, we have an expected deficit of $645 million, which is filled by both federal and state funding. And this has a slight adjustment from April when I presented it. The state crossover impact is lower because of the fuel reserves we were able to deploy. This slide just provides a view of the VDOT budget details by program, and the green amounts highlight changes. All of the ones that I enumerated earlier are highlighted and where they impact the programs. The only one I didn't was we have a need for some land use funding in our ground transportation planning and research program, and we had some excess resources in administration. And so that's a net change of 0, but the two programmatic allocations change from the results I presented to you in April. In terms of next steps, tomorrow you will consider a resolution to adopt the CTF, VDOT, and DRPT budgets. And of course, we'll be monitoring the General Assembly for any actions that may impact fiscal year '24 and VDOT, as well as the Commonwealth Transportation Fund as a whole. And with that.
Any questions for Ms. Farmer?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smoot?
Laura, if I followed this, there's about a $90 million reduction in the DRPT budget based on what it was previously there. What's going on there?
So there was a transportation initiative that the General Assembly funded. I think it was $83.5 million across 2 fiscal years, and 2023 is the second of the 2 fiscal years. So back in 2021, there was an initiative that the General Assembly allowed some transportation funding, and this change from 23 to 24 just removes that one-time funding.
Okay, and second question, I understand, but could be wrong, that the revenues associated with funding the I-81 improvement program are running in excess of what was budgeted. Is that correct?
In terms of previous assumptions,
Yes.
Yes, sir. The updated fuel tax revenue is higher than originally anticipated, and its share of the interstate program is also growing. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Farmer, clearly you inspire confidence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, Jen DeBrule, DRPT 6-year plan presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm going to brief you on the changes to our budget and 6-year program since we presented our draft to you back in April. So the good news is, in the overall scheme of things, in a $6 billion budget, our changes between draft and final are about $17 million. There's some minor funding adjustments on the revenue side, and then some changes based on some applications that I'll walk through in the next couple of slides. So starting with the transit program, we did receive some additional federal revenues over the 6-year period, so that's been reflected in the program. We did make a couple of additional recommended allocations. One is to set aside some funding for federal discretionary awards. We're very aggressively going after IIJA funding from the Federal Transit Administration. So this would give us some flexibility, or basically put some money aside that we would bring back to you in the form of transfers pending favorable consideration of those requests by request of FTA. We've also set aside a little bit of money for statewide transit marketing to support continued ridership recovery. We talked about that in the subcommittee this morning, that we did a considerable amount of marketing in partnership with the transit agencies in the areas that are still seeing depressed ridership, and we want to continue that work. And we also added a little bit of funding to support the state bus rodeo and safety programs. That's something we do every year, and we just did not pick that up in the draft program. Additionally, we added an appendix with the commuter choice projects. There's no financial change to the program as a result of this, but as a result of our MOA with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, we add those projects to our 6-year program, and we've done that for the item that we'll bring to you tomorrow for action. On the rail side, very small change, $1.1 million. This was an omission in our draft program. We program $1.1 million for rail planning each year. When we added the year to the program, we did not add the rail planning element for that last fiscal year, so that's the only change on the rail program. And then finally, our agency budget. If you'll recall, our agency budget, we actually project out actual expenditures for all of our programs. And so in looking at the planned expenditures over the next year, along with the projects that we've added, that changes our agency budget by $1.4 million. So minor change there. And with that, we'll bring you both a revised 6-year program and a revised agency budget tomorrow for action. So minor changes. And if, Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to make an introduction.
Please do.
Before I wrap up. Deanna? So standing up here and presenting financial data is outside of my comfort zone. So But over the last year, we've had a vacancy in our Chief Financial Officer position. I'm really, really excited that we've had Deanna Owari join us just last week as our new Chief Financial Officer. So thank goodness this is my last financial presentation to the board for DRPT. But Deanna comes to us from the state of Indiana, where she has over 20 years of progressively responsible experience, including serving as the Chief Financial Officer of the Indiana Department of Workforce Development, which is sort of like our VEC here in Virginia through the pandemic. But she's also worked in the Indiana State Budget Office. We were very, very fortunate that Deanna was in the process of relocating with her family here to Richmond when we were looking for a CFO. So super excited to have her join us. You're going to see her instead of me on finance things going forward. And anyway, do you want to say hello? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. This is, I think, day 6 for me, so I'm looking forward to working with you and with Jen and the rest of the transportation community in Virginia. So, thank you.
A warm welcome from our board. Look forward to working with you.
I'm happy to answer any questions. Here you go.
Questions from Mr. Brule? Again, you inspire confidence, Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Kim Pryor. 29, 6-year improvement program presentation.
Hopefully we can keep that confidence streak going.
I have confidence we can.
Well, secretary in here, that's part of why we.
I'm presenting to you today on the FY24 to 29 6-year improvement program. This slide shows the change between the draft and the final, as both Ms. Farmer and Mr. Brule pointed out, very minor changes in the program. The final program is valued at $25.9 billion, which is roughly a $300 million increase. The program includes $809 million in debt service, as well as funding for more than 4,700 projects. The current program also includes $3 billion provided by others. As a reminder, I shared this as part of the draft program as well. The revenue sharing program continues the reallocation of funds through FY24 based on the flexibility provided during the COVID period. By FY25 and forward, we return to $100 million annually for the revenue sharing program. The ITTF program, which is the carve-out of the High Priority Projects program, is set at $25 million annually. Unpaved roads, also funding from the Construction District Grant Program, is set at $25 million annually. We have incorporated the consensus scenario adopted by the board last month into the final program. We've also finalized covering those inflationary cost increases I briefed you about last month in this final program. And finally, we incorporated about a dozen or so federal earmarks through the Highway Infrastructure Program. Some highlights of changes between the draft and the final. We conducted our 9 spring public meetings across the state. We incorporated the small uplift Ms. Farmer mentioned that impacts the 5 formula programs, District Grant, High Priority Safety, SGR, and Interstate. Again, that was due to some release of the fuel reserve as well as some adjustments to debt service assumptions. Those small increases were just allocated to the balance entries for each of their respective programs. In addition, we converted $12.3 million of highway safety improvement program that was previously allocated to existing projects to, it's really just an administrative change in the allocation type to vulnerable road users. This is required by the Federal Highway Administration when more than 15% of the state's highway deaths are pedestrians. And so it's really just an administrative reclassification of those funds. We had projects already in the program that qualified for that funding, and so we've just made that change in color of funding. Additionally, we've incorporated the Smart Scale Round 5 consensus scenario adopted by the board last month. I will point out one small change to that. Included in the consensus scenario you saw last month was a project in Gloucester County. It was funded with high priority funds, $4 million. The Middle Peninsula Planning District Commission and Fredericksburg District requested that application 9350 for Route 17 at Woods Cross Road be removed from the consensus scenario in the program. So we have honored that request. The $4 million in high priority funds have been put back on the high priority statewide balance entry. Finally, we updated the I-81 program, as Ms. Farmer mentioned, based on revised estimates and debt service assumptions. There's a requirement in the code that projects funded through the 5 formula programs must be fully funded in the 6-year window. Based on these updates, we were unable to keep one of the projects in the 6-year program. We were just shy of having enough money to keep it in the program fully funded. So we removed the allocations from the project, took it out of the program, and the allocations are now sitting on the balance entry until we have enough to bring it in the 6-year window again. This slide is just a snapshot of the impact to the various funding programs. Again, hardly a noticeable change within rounding for each of the programs. Same for these last few listed here for even fiscal years and odd fiscal years. Very minor changes in the amount between the draft and the final. Next steps, I will be bringing to you tomorrow a resolution for adoption of the 6-year improvement program for FY24 through 29. The resolution will also include removing that Fredericksburg District high priority project from the consensus scenario. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Mr. Merrill.
Just one question. Thank you. Could you or Ms. Farmer comment on how we can reconcile the information in your presentation with the information in her presentation? Because in the 6-year plan that she presented, there was the roughly $18 billion for construction and $16 billion for maintenance. And I'm trying to understand exactly how this fits into her numbers.
Mr. Merrill, I'll take a stab at it to start. So there are components of the program that in the financial plan, I assume VDOT would execute every single dollar that's required. So for revenue sharing, for every $100 the state puts in, we match it with $100 local. However, there is a significant component of the 6-year program that is administered by localities, and those funds will never come into the department. And so in the program, they're what we call no post or allocations that represent money that will never come to the department because we're not administering the project. And so my assumptions related to how much more money is in construction really have more to do with revenue from others and how it's treated. And so from a global picture, we want to capture the entire investment in revenue sharing, but the 6-year program represents the execution of those projects. And so a significant chunk of it is locality-based projects that will not come to the department. They're in mine, they are not in Kim's.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kim, back on one of your earlier slides, it was $809 million for debt service. Now, I think I know what debt service is in my world, but State of Virginia, is this for interest payments or?
It's for servicing the debt associated with the Garvey bonds, as Ms. Farmer
Okay.
mentioned earlier.
All right.
We
thank
use
you.
federal funds to support that and pay for
Thank
that.
you.
Other questions for Ms. Pryor? Thank you. So we changed the program schedule a bit, and the Secretary has asked that we hold the Smart Scale program review until tomorrow. So we will now move into our VTrans presentation with Jatinder. And Mr. Lawson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I just wanted to start with a few opening comments before I turn it over to Jatinder. I want to thank you for your continued patience in working with us as we work through the VTrans and the Smart Scale process. It's kind of a big lift this time of year as we work through these. We've been trying to keep these in front of you as we go through, because I know in the past, sometimes we'll hit these big topics, go 2 or 3 months and come back to it again, and you've kind of lost what we're talking about before. So what we want to do today is just kind of bring together all the things that have happened over the past few months around VTrans, and then kind of leading us up to the goals presentation, excuse me, the objectives presentation that you'll see next month. So, Jitendra?
Lawson, Chair, members of the board, Jitendra Ramchandani. And today's presentation, as Deputy Secretary Lawson alluded, does not contain anything new or items that you haven't seen in the past. It essentially synthesizes what has been presented to you over the past 2 to 3 months in anticipation of something that the board has discussed at the workshop, which was conducted in March. And Mr. Kasper, as you mentioned, requested at the meeting last month, which is measurable objectives. Mm-hmm. So that is anticipated at the presentation next month. So this is sort of a preview of all the items that have been done to date before we share anything new next month. So just as a sort of a contextual item, VTrans is state's transportation plan that meets a number of federal as well as state requirements. It has 4 major focus areas: vision, goals, and objectives that you are seeing now and have been discussing for the past few months. Then the next portion is the transportation needs that become eligible for smart scale funding and priority consideration and revenue sharing. Then there's a long-term component, things that are on the horizon, electric vehicles, or shared mobility, things of that nature before strategic action. So it's a multi-year effort, and that's what Mr. Lawson was alluding to. The idea is to keep these items in front of you so that it becomes a bit easier. So the vision statement that is in front of you was presented back in April. Again, it sort of reiterates the desire to have best-in-class multimodal transportation system. It's not specific to any mode. It is encompassing all transportation modes, also connects to the end goal sort of economic growth and investments. The board also saw revised guiding principles last month. So I should note that all these items have been modified slightly in some instances, the ones that are in front of you right now, for clarity and for streamlining purposes. There isn't any substantive or wholesale changes to any of the items that you're seeing right now. So many of the items here include the discussions that the board has had around optimizing return on investments, improving safety, security, and resiliency, transparency, accountability, and essentially ensuring seamless intermodal connections. And finally, the goals. So the way I sort of think of it is vision, is where we want to be. Goals are sort of measurable steps, so large steps that we can take to get there, and then objectives are the measurable items that take us there and allow us to measure progress. So there are 4 goals that the board has seen in April. The first one involves system safety. The second one is around system preservation, which is to make sure that existing system is preserved. The third one is related to congestion and reliability, and the fourth one is related to interconnected systems. So essentially ensuring seamless multimodal system. Now, as Deputy Secretary Lawson alluded, the idea is to bring measurable objectives in front of you next month. Agencies are working on these items, and those will be presented next month to you with a request for action in September, assuming that there is no workshop in August. But that will set the stage for transportation needs that we plan to bring to you in October, and with a request for adoption in December timeframe. Keeping in mind this timeline is in draft form and can change based on the direction from the board. With that, I will answer any questions or elaborate any items that may be needed.
Jitendra, I have a request, actually.
Yes, sir.
So, and thank you for your good work on this and keeping us updated kind of iteratively through these board meetings. As I read the Virginia Code section requiring or identifying the requirements for our transportation board to develop and update the state plan, there's some very specific requirements in that code. Could I ask that at our next presentation, one of your handouts include the work that we're doing and how it relates to the specific requirement in the code section. For instance, we talked about the measurable objectives, but there's other components that need to be included by code as well. If you could give us just a simple comparison of the work that we're doing and the section of the code that it speaks to or complies with, I think that'd be helpful, just to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction on this.
Sure.
Thank you.
Mr.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Hines?
thank you. Jitender, you know how much I enjoy this work, so I appreciate all that you do. A change was made to guiding principle number 6 that I was hoping you could talk about a little, how you envision it working. So this is the coordination between transportation and land use. And I think that under the old version, it said, encourage local governments to plan and manage transportation efficient. It's been changed to collaborate. And having served on a local board, I know how jealously local boards guard their responsibility for land use. So what does that change to the word collaborate mean here in terms of how we or VDOT and DRPT will interact with local governments?
Sure, and I will take a stab at it. And Commissioner, DRPT Director, please chime in as needed. So this was the idea was to have a much more collaborative relation to ensure that the impacts of land use development on transportation system are accounted for and are reflected in the day-to-day planning. It is also reflective of some of the initiatives that VDOT has taken, such as arterial preservation, that account for land use development, access management, things of that nature, and how the nearby transportation facilities are impacted by them. So the idea was to be a bit more proactive than we have been in the past. And with that, I will see if Deputy Secretary Johns has thoughts.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Hines, I think the change in the wording here really gets to what your comment. It is the local government's responsibility to manage land development. And so what we were trying to do here is to say, we're here to collaborate with you to make this the best we can, but we really have to take your lead because you're the one that are putting forth the land use planning for your locality. Commissioner, you had something else you wanted to add there, but we can't tell them what to go do. That's not our job.
Collaborate implies a partnership to me, and maybe that's just me. Coordinate might be a better word but I don't know. This one really jumped out at me and didn't feel comfortable, given some of the experiences I've actually had where, a land use, a locality was doing some significant planning for expansion without considering whether a road really could be widened or not. And we did not feel it was our place to say that. So I guess ask you to think about this one a little bit more carefully because I think it implies something we don't have the power to do, but yet we need to be aware of and support where we can. So I don't know what the right word is.
We'll be glad to look at it. We were trying to actually address what you're saying, and perhaps we didn't.
I'm not sure you're there
properly
yet.
do it, but that was the attempt.
And then, Mr. Kaspertz, if I could, I have one other, observation on Goal C, which is about congestion and travel time reliability. Often when we say the word congestion, we are talking about road congestion. That's what most people think about. There is transit congestion. There is sidewalk and other kinds of congestion that we potentially need to worry about. And so I think you mean across modes, but I think it would be helpful to say it here and not just, because then it says providing multiple modes and routes. Again, is it by providing multiple modes? And anyway, there's just something here that again, given the multimodal experience I've had, I have lived through very congested transit, very congested sidewalks, very congested stations that have nothing to do with cars.
I want to.
Sellers.
On number 6, I think you bring up a good point, but I would say it's not just local governments that we need to collaborate and coordinate with, particularly in fast-growing counties. The development community, it needs to be part of it as well. And in the Fredericksburg region, you'll hear a lot of our development communities say VDOT has a huge backlog of getting things through as well. So they have complaints with local government, but also with VDOT and getting their permits. And so maybe expand that to not just local governments, but the private sector as well.
Mr. Merrill.
Yeah, at the risk of getting into wordsmithing, but consideration of flipping the order and putting number 2, number 1. Because it just seems to me, sometimes people just look at the first statement, and it just seems to me that number 2 is really an overarching objective of ours. I'm not suggesting changing the wording, just perhaps have number 2 be the number 1 in the sequence.
Mr. Kasprowitz, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ms. Hines.
I actually, I'm going to really be looking forward to the objectives. But that makes me also think about the midterm needs, which is the next piece that comes. And I don't know what state of accounting for the investments in the 3 regional transportation districts, our entities are. That was an issue last year or the last time we did this in my district, was that much of the funding that the regional entity had put on projects wasn't actually reflected in the midterm needs analysis. So I had a lot of things on my list that really weren't eligible because they were already funded or the studies had already been done. So I'm just saying out loud, Mr. Amtantani, that it would be lovely to have that done in advance so that I and people from Hampton and Central Virginia are looking at what we really could identify as midterm needs as opposed to things that are already funded.
Other questions? Gentlemen, thank you. Jatinder, we'll look forward to your July presentation. Okay, next up, Mr. Brule.
So you have my normal update in your folder, but I will draw your attention to a couple of things. On the rail side, we received a federal award under the FRA Railroad Crossing Elimination Program to upgrade safety at 4 rural crossings on the 95 corridor, so it's all part of that Transforming Rail in Virginia corridor. We had a really nice event in Spotsylvania just a couple weeks ago, so feel really good about that as maybe a sign of good things to come with these Federal Railroad Administration discretionary awards. That program was oversubscribed, I think 4 or 5 times the available funding, and so we got our full request. We're going to be bringing you a brand new statewide rail map. There's a preview of that in your folder as well. Hopefully we'll have those printed and available for you in July. On the public transportation side, another nice award. We completed the HJ 542 study last summer. Received a national recognition award for that last week. Grant Sparks, who was our project manager, and I attended that event in DC last week. So nice recognition of a study that was very complex and one of a kind. So like sharing that good news. On the ridership front, the rest of the slides in the deck are all ridership. Our trends all continue to move in the positive direction, really seeing some positive ridership returns with WMATA or with Metro, particularly Metro Rail, and also starting to see a little bit of a rebound with VRE. Over the past couple weeks, I have been very fortunate to ride both of those systems quite a bit, and it's nice to see more folks out there using those resources. Virginia Breeze is also doing well, continuing to exceed our expectations there. And then the last slide in there is Amtrak ridership. Amtrak ridership also, we continue to set new records each month. The cautionary note that I shared with the subcommittee this morning is that we are still riding the cusp of adding service last summer. with a third Norfolk train and a second Roanoke train. So we do expect to see that big bump kind of level out a little bit when we get into the summer, just because we're not going to be in a position to add more service again until 2026. So that wraps up my report for this.
Mr. Brule, thank you. We had a detailed presentation in the subcommittee on this morning, and I'd call your attention to slide 8, which shows a graphic representation of April ridership in the various categories in various years. Very positive trends. You know, if you look at the prior slide, it's a little hard to discern what the actual improvements are, but if you go to page 8, it shows that we're making good progress on all fronts. Thank you, Jen.
Chairman, are you
Ms.
guys
Sellers.
seeing, you have like Fridays in June are free on the VRE. Are you seeing ridership increase on Fridays because of that?
So generally speaking, when they have done fare-free, VRE did some fare-free back in the fall, their ridership jumps up quite a bit. You see more folks that maybe are going to DC for the day that haven't chosen VRE to try VRE on those fare-free days. So we don't have their data yet for the month of June because we're in the middle of it, but we'll be looking at that closely.
Commissioner Bretsch.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I have 2 items that to bring to your attention this month for the anticipation of the action agenda in July. Both of these items, we don't feel, or I don't feel that they should take up the time of a workshop item, and you'll see why. The first is a federal grant that we applied to the Federal Highway Administration on behalf of the Department of Motor Vehicles. Back in November of 2021, we submitted a grant for a Surface Transportation System Funding Alternatives program on behalf of the Department of Motor Vehicles. And that grant was to provide funding for a demonstration project for user-based alternative revenue mechanisms, in other words, mileage-based user fees that we went through and submitted that application on behalf of DMV. This past March, we were notified that the grant application was successful, and that value of that grant is $3.3 million that DMV would use for its mileage-based user fee program. Since we did apply for it, and it is through the Federal Highway Administration, what we'd be asking the board to take action on is just allowing VDOT to enter into an agreement with Federal Highways to be able to receive that money. If the board does approve that authorization for us to enter into that, then we would turn around and execute a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Motor Vehicles to prosecute the work under the federal guidelines. So it's really a pass-through grant. So our action item that we'll be asking for is just simply enter into an agreement with the federal government to receive that money and then pass it through to FHWA, or I'm sorry, to Department of Motor Vehicles. The second item I have for you has to do with memorandums of understandings with Federal Highway Administration regarding tolling. We have presented to the board a number of times our Hampton Roads Express Lane network, the full 45 miles that we have, what I'll say is divided up into multiple sections. I'm happy to report that the high-rise bridge section is about to come online later this summer. So we would be asking the board to allow the department to enter into another memorandum of understanding with Federal Highway Administration for tolling on that section, but at the same time recognizing that we presented a number of times about the full 45 miles, that I would be asking for a blanket waiver to enter into subsequent agreements to allow us just to execute the tolling agreements with FHWA for the full 45 miles once, recognizing that, again, we've been in front of the board multiple times on the express lane network down there. So those are the 2 items. We'll have a little bit more color around each of those actions, similar to what I said here in the action meeting, but I didn't think that it warranted a full workshop agenda item on those 2 items.
Thank you. Any questions for the commissioner? Mr.
Mr.
Lawson?
Commissioner, forgive me, but what is a mileage-based user fee?
It's an alternative to gas tax. So it would allow, my understanding, and there might be some other people in the room smarter than me, that we have a number of people that have opted out of paying gas tax, but would allow them to be charged an annual fee for the miles that they drive. It's an alternative to the gas tax.
Mr. Commissioner?
I think we'll allow John to come up and
I have one in my car. I have
add a little
measuring
more color than what I have.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lawson, as part of the omnibus bill, transportation bill, that was the highway use fee was imposed on cars that get better fuel economy. So they're, in addition to a car that gets basically better than 25 miles per gallon, it's an assumed 11,600 miles, and you get a computation of an additional tax because you're buying less gas. What Virginia's mileage choice program is it gives anyone that would be paying that highway use fee an option to join in the program with the assumption that if they drive less than 11,600 miles, what they have to pay would actually get reduced. So it's actually a program that allows them to pay less of an additional tax, but it's also a program that was created to help the state and others learn more about how a mileage-based user fee could work. Because there's a lot of thought nationally that, the gas tax is going away, and there's got to be some alternative. So there's a lot of exploration around a mileage-based fee, and that's the purpose of this program. DMV has stood up has a system, a computer-based system, obviously, that's running this now, and that's what this $3 million is going toward, is supporting that application.
So it's a voluntary thing,
Voluntary.
or this is going to go after Mr. Brown and his electric cars because he's not paying for gas?
That's Mr. Brown could sign up for the program if he thinks, and it would be beneficial to him if he drives less than 11,600 miles a year.
Mr. Chairman, I'm participating in the program. I have a hybrid. So I have a little thing that slides into a place to the left of my steering column, and every month I get a notice that says you can go look and see what your mileage was. I had to put in some level of money to start, and if I'm over, they take a little bit of the money away, and if I'm not, they just hold it. So I have monthly information about how much I'm driving. And CTB meetings are a huge chunk of my driving. I just want you all to know, especially when we went to Stanton.
Right.
Other questions for the commissioner? Okay, hearing none, we're going to adjourn the meeting for today. I'm sorry, we're going to suspend the meeting for today, restarting tomorrow morning with the secretary's return. 9 o'clock. We're hoping his flight gets in on time. And Carol will give us, let me first suspend.